and there's about 1.5 million guest workers, skilled guest workers. And I'm not talking about ag workers or people working in hotels. Those are unskilled guest work. I'm talking about skilled guest workers, so people with bachelor's degrees, competing with people who have bachelor's degrees in the U.S. And so you got 1.5 million, and there's only 60,000 actual green cards. That's actual immigration that go to workers in the employment-based scheme. So that's EB1, employment-based 1, 2, 3, the preference scheme. So you have 1.5 million guest workers chasing 60,000 slots for green cards. That's about 25-to-1 ratio. So we really don't have a skilled immigration system. We have a skilled guest worker program with a very tiny kind of skilled immigration system. So if you took a step back, my first and most important recommendation is, hey, we got to rethink this whole thing.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim. I am the CEO of American Moment, and we're very glad to have you back with us this week. We've got today in studio Dr. Ron Hira of Howard University talking about skilled guest worker programs here in the United States. But before I get to reading his bio, I got to highlight a couple things that we got going on. Unfortunately, if you wanted to apply for the Summer Fellowship for American Statecraft, that application's closed. In fact, by the time this episode will have come out, we will have already selected all of our summer fellows. My whole week this week is just doing fellowship interviews. But not to worry, if you would like to take part in the Fellowship for American Statecraft in the fall, we will have that application going up probably in the next month or two. So make sure to keep an eye out for that. If you are in DC now, currently in the spring, or if you plan on being here through an internship or you just got a new job or whatever and want to join some of American Moment's programming in the summer, we have two academic programs, one which is Foundations of American Statecraft, where you can join us all day on Friday for a series of policy lectures and trainings on how to actually get things done in this town. Everything from, House and Senate procedure to how we actually fix some of these guest worker programs. And foreign policy and everything in between. So you could join us for that. Or if you're currently an intern on Capitol Hill, or you will be in this summer, we host a lunch series called AM Fridays in the Senate. We basically cater like thousands of dollars of Chick-fil-A, and then we bring in a really cool speaker. Pretty low commitment, but it's some time that you get to spend with us every week, and you get free food. It's always a good thing. So make sure to check out all of that programming on our website at americanmoment.org. And now I will introduce Dr. Ron Hira. We had a great conversation about the myriad of guest worker programs here in the United States. The crazy thing is, that we run a lot of these systems via lottery. We just kind of pick at random who we're going to let come and work in this country. And then we also talked about the fact that we don't really know how many of these people are here. So it was a very engaging conversation. I know that the guest worker programs, particularly H-1B, is a very hot topic right now. So we're very grateful for Dr. Hira being willing to join us. Dr. Ron Hira is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University. Ron is also a research associate with the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and prior to joining Howard, he served on the faculty of the Rochester Institute of Technology. Hira has written widely on offshoring, high-scaled immigration, innovation and employment relations, and the decline of the middle class. He recently co-edited the book Engineering, Globalization, Reshoring, and Nearshoring, Management and Policy Issues. Hira is co-author of the book Outsourcing America, which came out in 2008, and is a finalist, or was a finalist, for Best Business Book in the PMA's Benjamin Franklin Awards. The Boston Globe called Outsourcing America an honest, disturbing look at outsourcing. The Washington Post described the book as a thorough and easy-to-grasp primer on the wrenching outsourcing debate. Dr. Hira has testified numerous times before the U.S. Congress about high-skilled immigration and offshoring, and previously worked as a controller, systems engineer, and program manager with Sensitech, NIST, and George Mason University. Ron completed his postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia University's Center for Science, Policy, and Outcomes He holds a PhD in public policy and an MS in electrical engineering from George Mason University and a BS in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University. He is a licensed professional engineer and a senior member of IEEE. That is quite a bio. As we talk here in the introduction, he had a very non-linear career path to getting where he is now. Hopefully, you guys will be very interested in what he has to say. We will go now to Dr. Ron Hira. Dr. Hira, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So, we always like to start the show hearing a little bit about our guest's background, how they got where they are, how they got interested in their specific policy area. We were talking before the show that you had a very non-linear career path to get to where you are now. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I studied electrical engineering in the 1980s at Carnegie Mellon University, and I started working in this area in the Washington, D.C. area in the defense industry, and decided to go back to school. I did a master's degree in engineering, and I got a job at NIST, which is a large government research laboratory, in the early 1990s. And I got more interested. I was actually in a robotics division, and we even had self-driving cars or semi-self-driving cars way back in the early 90s on campus. And you would think that would be very interesting, but I got more interested in why the government was funding us to do what we were doing, as opposed to doing the actual robotics research. So I made a bit of a pivot, and I went into technology policy. So I did and practiced that to some extent, the extent that you can at a place like NIST. And then I decided to go back and do a PhD in public policy. So I did that at George Mason, and then I've been an academic since then. So I've been interested in engineering and public policy, but in particular around so-called STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, employment issues, workforce issues. I'm a second-generation electrical engineer. I know a lot about the employment market. And then I got interested also in immigration policy, because that's a big part of the STEM employment story.
Yeah. And you're currently a professor at Howard. These are very broad interests. What kinds of classes are you teaching on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. Whenever you're in a university, you tend to teach the broader classes, and then you can do research on pretty much anything you want. And that was the attraction for me to go into academics, was as long as you're publishing and doing things like that, the publish or perish model. As long as you're publishing regularly and you're doing good work, it doesn't matter what you end up doing your research on. And then you've got to cover your classes. So I teach classes primarily in public policy, American government, as well as public administration, which is the management of government.
Very cool. What we were talking about before the show, kind of the big news recently is that the H-1B lottery for fiscal year 2026 is now open. It opened on the Friday before we were recording this. What is going on? Has anything changed under the new administration? What's happening?
No, actually, nothing has changed. It looks like it's business as usual, which is, I think, bad news for firms that are really trying to get very specialized talent. But it's also bad news for U.S. workers because the lottery system has no link whatsoever to merit. Right. So you're not selecting the best people. The worst people or the ordinary skilled people have the same chances as the very best skilled people who you're going to bring in as a guest worker to compete with U.S. workers. And so that's just a system that's not based on competence or merit. It would be like a university taking all the applications it got and then selecting their student class just randomly. Through a lottery. It doesn't make much sense, right? And pretty much everybody disagrees, or agrees that that should be changed, and it hasn't been changed this time around. So that's a disappointment.
Yeah. What's the history behind why it's a lottery in the first place?
So there's an annual cap on the visa program, on the H-1B program, which is a skilled worker visa program. And what we mean by skilled is they're Yeah, minimum eligibility standards is you have to have at least a bachelor's degree to qualify. And so there's an annual cap of new workers who can come in, and it's 85,000. 20,000 are set aside for people who have advanced degrees, meaning a master's degree or a professional degree like a JD or an MBA. And because it wasn't always oversubscribed, but over the last 15 years or so, it's become immediately oversubscribed. So the annual cap gets used up. There's more applications than slots on the first day that application period opens. And so what USCIS, that's the Immigration Service, decided, and they made this choice. It's not in statute. They made this choice administratively, was to run a random lottery. And so each application that came in on that first day that the window opened, and now it's 5 days, but when it immediately comes, that we're going to treat each application equally, and then we'll run a lottery. Now, the Trump administration in the first term, Trump 45, had proposed to instead use a more rational process, which would be to actually select the best 85,000. And just to give you a sense, there were about 400,000 applications in that immediate opening for the 85,000 slots. So you have about a 1 in 4.5 chance, about 20% chance or so to win that lottery. What the Trump administration had proposed to do was to select the 20% best out of the 400,000 instead of treating everybody equally.
Yeah. So why did they decide in the first place to do it as a lottery? Is it just that, there are, so not just that there are so many, right, but the resources required to vet every single one and see like who is the best fit? Like it took too many resources to do that, or?
No, it's not because of that. The statute is written as I forget the exact language, but there's some ambiguity in the statute, and it says it's basically as they come in, you process them, because the statute never anticipated it would be oversubscribed,
right?
Or if it was oversubscribed, it wouldn't be immediately oversubscribed, right?
Right.
So if you go about 20 years ago, it would take until January or February, 6-7 months into the opening of a fiscal year before it got oversubscribed. And so,
right.
It would be just as they came in, you would do it. So they had to invent a way of selecting when it became immediately oversubscribed. And they chose a random lottery. It didn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
For example, you could select by the highest wages or the highest wage level, which is what the Trump administration tried to do through regulations.
Yeah.
So this was an administrative choice. It wasn't a statutory choice. It wasn't a choice by Congress to select it by lottery.
Yeah.
Now, since then, they wrote regs. The DHS wrote regs to make it a lottery, but they could rewrite regs right within the statutory authority to do it a different way.
Yeah, the reason I had to ask the follow-up is because it's just such an unbelievably bad system. Like I'm sort of in shock that was what they chose, was to do a lottery.
Yeah, and so almost universally that process has been panned by people as far away from my own politics as like Cato and Heritage. There's pretty much everybody universally, and almost every economist who analyzes policy analysts who looks at this says this is not the way you would select.
Yeah.
Right. Why would you take a underpaid, indentured servant, being paid $60,000 a year and give them an equal chance as somebody who's being paid $350,000 a year? It doesn't make any sense, but that's the way it's set up. And it even goes worse than that. And that is because certain firms know how to, because of their business model, know how to manipulate the process. And they basically rigged the lottery system. So instead of having the 20% chance that the, super expert at, that some startup is trying to hire, instead of that 20% chance, these outsourcing firms have rigged it so that they have a 100% chance. They get every single visa that they want because of the way the lottery system's set up.
So how have they done that? How have these firms rigged that process?
Right. So if you're a large firm, and so for example, like Cognizant or an Infosys, and these are the leading H-1B recipients, and they have been the leading recipients for 20 years, their business model is to offshore as much work as possible. And so they might have, let's say, 250,000 workers worldwide, but 200,000 of them are in India.
Mhm.
So those are people who are educated, but they're paid a lot less, right? So they might be paid, a salary here might be $90,000 for an IT worker. There, it'll be about $10,000 or $12,000. One of my cousins working in, Bangalore or Bombay. And so their incentive is to have as much of the work, the back office IT work for every Fortune 500 company is almost all of those are outsourced to these companies, is to offshore as much work as possible. So they have a roughly 70-30 model. So 70% of their work is done offshore, about 30% is done on site in the US. The reason why you don't offshore everything is you can't offshore everything, right?
Mhm.
So if you're doing these systems, you've got to talk with the customers, and the customers are in the US. So I have these large pools of workers offshore in India. So let's say you have 150,000 workers in India, and you're anticipating that you need, let's say, 4,000 additional visas next year because of growth, because you don't want to hire Americans. You want to bring in visa workers because they're cheaper and they're indentured, and you can transfer the work easier offshore.
Mhm.
So let's say you need 4,000. Now, if you put 4,000 applications in and you got a 20% chance, you're only going to get 800 of those, right? So what they do instead is they up that by 5. So they'll put in 20,000 applications,
Mm.
figuring that their odds are going to be 20%. And so they put 20,000 in, they get 1 in 5, they're going to get the 4,000 that they want. And the reason they can do that is those 20,000 workers have generic skills. And so they're interchangeable. They don't care which 1 in 5 of those workers offshore get the visa.
Yeah.
They know 4 or 5 or not, but the 1 in 5 that they get, that's fine because they've got these generic ordinary skills that are interchangeable. And so they bring those workers in, and they get 100% of the workers they want.
Yeah. Wow. That is mind blowing. So they must have then a pretty large pool if they're constantly submitting, 80% more than what they actually need. What does their pipeline look like? Like, is this like presumably it's like millions of people?
Yeah, I think people don't understand the scale of India.
Yeah.
It's about 1.4 billion people, but they have about 400 million people below the age of 18.
Mhm.
And so they have a large pool of people. So even if you get a small sliver of those people that go to engineering colleges, then you're going to get a very large pool of people. And the wage rates there are much lower. So you're competing, and it's one thing for IBM to compete its U.S. workers against its Indian workers, which it does, and Accenture does this, and Deloitte does this. But what they're doing is there's certain jobs in the U.S. that are geographically sticky that you simply cannot offshore, right? And the question is, do you fill those jobs with U.S. workers? Those are U.S. jobs. They're on U.S. soil, right? What those firms have figured out is that they can import these guest workers on H-1Bs at much lower rates. So at lower wages and in worse working conditions because they're tied to their employer.
Right.
And so they prefer to do that. This is one of, I think, the untold stories in all of the discussion around offshoring is how much white-collar offshoring that there's been. These companies, especially in the services, financial services, IT services, huge numbers of people in India doing that back office white-collar kind of work. But we're not counting that because we don't count the trade and services. So we don't see the trade deficit that's going on there.
Right. Was this sort of an intentional, policy choice in India to, train up such a large amount of young people that could do these kinds of jobs? So, like, it almost seems to, fit so perfectly with the American companies that desire to offshore. It almost seems like it was a policy choice made like 15 to 20 years ago.
Yeah, there were a number of policy choices that India and the Indian government made. Now, there was some investment in education, but a lot of that's just private, people sending their kids, saving up, and prioritizing education, and then educational institutions expanding. But a lot of that was the companies themselves. So whether they were the Indian companies or the U.S. companies that were trying to offshore their workers, they invested in workforce development and training in India as opposed to in the U.S. because they saw the opportunities. It was cheaper to hire those folks, and so they saw that opportunity to expand their workforce. IBM took this approach back in 2005, 2006, where they talked about a globally integrated enterprise. Sam Palmisano, who was CEO at the time, and talked about rebalancing its workforce. But what you did was you sucked away all of the workforce development and training from the U.S. and put it into India. But I think there's a misunderstanding about the capacity in the U.S. I mean, we have plenty of STEM workers in the U.S., and our educational institutions are better than anything in India.
Mm-hmm.
The Indian training, at the very elite level is very good, but that's a small sliver, right? Most of what's going on are, people at kind of ordinary professional. These are good jobs, but they're at ordinary professional jobs. These are not jobs that can't be done by U.S. workers.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time on this podcast. With past guests talking about how, this is ultimately driven by a desire at a lot of these companies to, increase their bottom line. We've spent time talking about how it's kind of boxed out, basically a Native American, native-born American workforce. What we haven't really talked about, and this is just popping into my head right now, is like what the deal actually is when you come into the United States as an H-1B worker. We understand that these companies are frequently taking advantage of these people as well, but do they go on to have good lives here? Do they have a desire to stay? Like, what's the general consensus on that?
Yeah, so I think these are interesting parts of the immigration story and parts of the H-1B story that aren't well understood. So first off, why would one of my cousins, and I've literally had cousins who've come over on H-1Bs, why would they come and be in a circumstance that's not as good as a U.S. worker, right? Why are they willing to be underpaid? Why are they willing to be in working conditions that are substandard? And the reason is because it's a lot better than their conditions back home. The other part of this, so let's say I'm 20-something, I come over, right, and I'm paid $60,000 instead of $90,000 for a job. Well, that $60,000 is still a huge premium over what I would get paid back at home, which is maybe $10,000 or $12,000 a year. And then secondly, even if I come just temporarily for 3 or 4 years, or maybe even 6 years, I've got now customer-facing experience. And so when I return home, instead of getting that 10 or 12, I'm going to get 18 or 20,000 because there's a wage premium to having been in the U.S. The other part of it is there's an incentive because the employer can then choose to sponsor me for a green card. And that's kind of the golden ticket. So they can dangle that out in front of me. And I'll, again, accept lower wages and worse working conditions with a hope that maybe I'll get a green card. And that's, again, kind of a lottery process in and of itself. So there's a lot of reasons why the foreign guest workers will choose substandard wages and substandard working conditions because it's substandard compared to the U.S., but it's better than back home. And they're hoping maybe they'll get a green card, maybe they won't. But remember, they're guest workers. They're only guests in the U.S. as long as they're working. And so they're under a different employment regulations and different employment regime. And it's one where they have a lot less control over their own agency, their own livelihoods.
Yeah. Yeah, it's bad enough that a lot of these companies are basically practicing indentured servitude. But what are some of the horror stories that have been publicly reported about how some of these companies have treated some of these workers?
Yeah, so the system is set up to fail. All right, the compliance system, the accountability system, the administrative system, governance. It's set up on what's called a complaint-driven system. So the only way the Department of Labor ever finds out that there's a problem with H-1Bs being mistreated is if an H-1B worker complains. Well, if you come in and you're sponsored by an employer, the employer holds your visa. You don't hold it, right? They're making all of those choices. It's employer-driven. And are you really going to complain against an employer for mistreating you if they hold your visa? And what I mean by holding your visa, your legal status in the U.S.
Yeah.
So if you're laid off, if they terminate you, then you have 60 days to either find another job or leave the country. And if you've been here 5 years, 7 years, maybe you have a house, maybe you have kids, you want to stay in the U.S., you're going to do whatever the employer says. So part of it is that there's really underreporting. There's no audit system, right?
Right.
I mean, people wouldn't pay their taxes unless they were a fear of an audit, right?
Yeah.
But the compliance system here is all complaint driven. And in the case of U.S. workers being undercut, there's almost no recourse. Even if you complain, most of what abuse that goes on is legal. So there are lots of horror stories, but we don't hear much. And guest workers, where there have been coalitions of groups that represent guest workers, they've been afraid to criticize the program because they fear that if they criticize the program, that maybe Congress will do something about this, or maybe the administration will do something about this. Then there's uncertainty about their situation.
Right.
So they have no reason even collectively to come out and say, hey, the H-1B program is broken. There are problems here.
Yeah, no, you were right. It seems totally designed to fail. So something that you've done, a lot of work on has been thinking about how we could fix this program to find, actual solutions. I know you mentioned that in Trump term one, they basically were trying to find the top 20% of people that were the most qualified. What are, should the president look at that again? Are there other things you think that you would tack onto that? Do you think we should, decrease the number of these visas we allow? Like, what's your general take on how we should reform the program?
Right. So let me take it from a sort of a big picture point of view, and then I'll get into the granular more details of what can be done on the H-1B program. And then there's a whole alphabet soup of other programs.
Yeah.
But just from a big picture point of view, one of the things that gets lost in our discussion around skilled immigration, and I use that term immigration, is that there's really not much immigration involved. Most of our skilled system in terms of employment are set up around guest worker programs. So the H-1B is the most well-known and deservedly so. There's about 600,000. It's the largest of the skilled guest workers. And that's a lot of people, 600,000 people in the U.S., 85,000 each year. But then they can stay long periods of time. And so cumulatively, we don't know for sure how many are here. And that's kind of embarrassing, right? That we don't actually know who leaves and who converts. But there's about 600,000 there. But there's the L1, L as in Larry, which is intra-companies for multinationals. There was a major Bloomberg story scandal about some of the largest L1 programs. That's being abused very widely. There's the OPT, the optional practical training, which is not even supposed to be a work visa, but it really is. That's where international students can stay 3 years and have work permits. You add all of these together, and there's about 1.5 million guest workers, skilled guest workers. And I'm not talking about ag workers or people working in hotels. Those are unskilled guest work. I'm talking about skilled guest workers, so people with bachelor's degrees competing with people who have bachelor's degrees in the U.S. And so you got 1.5 million, and there's only 60,000 actual green cards. That's actual immigration that go to workers in the employment-based scheme. So that's EB1, employment-based 1, 2, 3, the preference scheme. So you have 1.5 million guest workers chasing 60,000 slots for green cards. That's about 25-to-1 ratio. So we really don't have a skilled immigration system. We have a skilled guest worker program with a very tiny kind of skilled immigration system. So if you took a step back, my first and most important recommendation is, hey, we got to rethink this whole thing, and we should be rebalancing so that that ratio is not 25-to-1, that it's more about immigration, a lot less about guest workers. And how you do that, either you up the green card numbers or you lower the guest worker numbers, or you do, a combination of both to get that balanced much better. And that would be better for those workers, foreign workers who are coming, because they'd have rights as immigrants, but it'd be also good for the U.S. workers they're competing with because they won't be undercut. They'll have the same rights as U.S. workers have. And so when you have a guest worker program, by definition, that's anti-worker. The guest workers have a lot fewer rights, and they're competing against U.S. workers. That's bad. It's wage theft, bad for the guest worker, but it's also bad for the U.S. workers that they're competing with, who get undercut along the way. So that's the big picture, is that we've got this imbalance between it's way too many guest workers, way too few green cards, chasing way too few green cards. Now, the more specifics on the H-1B, the Trump administration took a number of executive actions in the Trump 45. The first one was something called the Buy America, Hire America, American executive order, which they did in April of 2017, which asked the agencies to lay out plans. It wasn't until 2020 that the actual Department of Labor and DHS, or the two agencies that oversee this, started to take actions. So there's a number of actions in terms of rulemaking regulations that the Department of Labor undertook, as well as DHS undertook, that would vastly improve the H-1B program and also the L-1 and the green card programs. On the Department of Labor, there's two things: raising the prevailing wage. So prevailing wage sounds like a market wage, but it's not. Department of Labor artificially sets it way below market wages. So the Department of Labor had proposed to make a more rational attempt at setting the prevailing wage so that it was closer to market wages. And then the second is to close something called the outsourcing loophole, where the Department of Labor would ensure that you could not get around the H-1B protection, the worker protections for U.S. workers, by just simply outsourcing your hiring of H-1B workers. So there's a couple of famous cases. Disney's probably the best known. Leo Pereiro, who, by the way, traveled around with Trump during his campaign back in 2016, was a displaced U.S. Disney worker. He testified before the Senate. He had to train his H-1B replacement. He complained. He went through the processes both to the Department of Labor as well as through the court system. And they said it's perfectly legal that you get forced to train your replacement. He said, how's that possible? This is not there's supposed to be protections written into the statute. Well, there was a loophole. Because Disney didn't directly hire the H-1B worker, the Department of Labor interpreted that to be it's okay because the contractor HCL hired them.
So if it's just one step removed, it's fine.
Okay. So it's a huge loophole, right?
Yeah.
Now, Department of Labor's created that loophole to an extent. They can close that loophole so that Disney cannot get around the protections and replace its U.S. workers with H-1Bs simply by hiring out the H-1B through an outsourcing company. Secretary Scalia had proposed policy guidance to change that, and they could have done that. The Biden administration let it die. And let's also say the Biden administration had opportunities to take up these things. They started to work on the prevailing wage and then just gave up because they must have had pressure. On the DHS side, they proposed to replace the random lottery with a wage-based level lottery system. That would have been one of the key things there. There's a couple of additional things that they could do to fix it. So we know what to do. We know there's huge problems. It's a question of whether people will actually take up the mantle and do something about it.
Is there any appetite for, fixing any of these things in Congress?
There has been appetite to reform the programs over the years, and it's been led by kind of an interesting set of political bedfellows. On the Senate side, you've had Chuck Grassley, who's a pretty conservative Republican from Iowa, who's been chair or ranking member of Judiciary over the years, teaming up with Dick Durbin, who's the number 2 or number 3 Democrat in the Senate, who has also been Judiciary chair or ranking member. And they've teamed up since 2007 at reintroducing reform to the H-1B and L-1 program. And they've attracted people like Bernie Sanders, and Jeff Sessions
Yeah.
to co-sponsor. So you get these very interesting kind of mixes. And then, on the House side, there's been companion bills. Those bills have been introduced. Parts of those got folded into the Gang of Eight 2013 bill that passed the Senate, S744, but not enough in terms of what the reforms are. But again, Congress is going to take its lead from the administration. So, you're a student of politics and how Congress works. You know that Congress often cannot go against a White House. So if the White House decides, hey, we're going to put some pressure to actually make some statutory changes, those would be durable changes, and they would be better to get it through Congress.
Yeah. Do you think that the appetite is still there? Thinking back to the campaign in 15 and 16, right? Like reducing legal immigration was a big part of the campaign. It's still mentioned, but it seems like less so. Do you think that, prioritizing mass deportations and stopping, the illegal immigration regime has sort of taken precedence over fixing some of these legal loopholes?
So I don't do politics. I do
Yeah.
policy, and obviously you have to know a little bit of the politics. Certainly it was, the H-1B scandals of Disney, University of California. Imagine that. Research university forcing its U.S. IT workers, 80 of them, to train their H-1B replacements. Think about that. I mean, and Janet Napolitano was chancellor of UC, and she used to be DHS secretary. So she understood the exploitation. So I think, the news cycle is such that, back in 15, 16, it was more prominent. It came up on some of the presidential nomination debates and things like that. So you didn't hear it as much this time around, but we did hear in December a blow up on X, right, on Twitter between Musk and Bannon. And Bannon, of course, knows this issue really well because he covered it with Breitbart back in 15 and 16. And by the way, he's correct on this issue. Musk was mostly wrong, which showed up in terms of the X response from the public.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a very interesting time to be on X. I think it started on Christmas Eve. So I spent basically all of Christmas week following this, and we did an episode with Kevin Lynn about that a few weeks ago, which was a lot of fun. You were talking about I know you say that you're very focused on the policy, but this is a very politically minded show. So, but the one thing that I want to highlight that you said that's very interesting to me is talking about these 4 senators, that are very interested in reforming this program. And my guess would be, I'll wait to hear from you, but that they all have different reasons as to why. So, like my guess for Bernie Sanders, as an example, would be, corporations taking advantage of people, whereas, Senator Sessions, was very interested in, supporting American workers and that sort of thing. So how did that coalition come to be, I guess is my question.
Yeah. So I think that's two sides of the same coin, right? So corporations taking advantage of workers, right? And then, American workers being undercut by foreign labor because of the way the corporations are exploiting the system. I think, I'll get back to your question, but I think it's kind of interesting because if you did try to push a bill through and, I don't know if the Democrats have moved away from, comprehensive immigration or nothing, you might be able to get a bipartisan bill together that could pass muster and get 60 votes in the Senate. And so it would be an interesting test case of doing a bipartisan immigration bill to reform the H-1B, L-1, the other visa programs, or even skilled immigration overall. So part of what blocked it before is I understand the politics, and I understand just a little bit of it, was the Democrats were not willing to let skilled immigration go through. And it was kind of a bargaining chip, right? So they would give away some H-1Bs in return for legalization of undocumented. On the Republican side, you've got a split between sort of the establishment Republicans who more is always better and more guest workers, the Chamber of Commerce playing a role there. The administration wanted to push kind of a populist, and this is a part of the problem with the way the mainstream media covered the whole Musk, Bannon, MAGA kind of feud, was they thought it was inside the Republican or inside the conservative movement. There's a divide within the Democrats too, right? The people who look out for workers as opposed to the ones that are, much closer to corporations.
Yeah.
So this is really a classic sort of elite populist divide. And you could cobble together enough populists from both parties, maybe, to get something through if you wanted to, but it would require really the White House to push.
Yeah, it seems to me to kind of be like a horseshoe theory thing, where you would get like say a Bernie Sanders and a Josh Hawley, like you did on the stimulus checks or something like that.
Yeah, but it's also the correct thing. I mean, the policy of this is just so obvious, right? So you have a system where they claim this is to fill shortages, right? We're only bringing in H-1Bs as a last resort to fill a shortage, right? And that's the concept behind it. Any guest worker program. It's an intervention into the market. You should be having a high bar. But if you look at it, how it's actually implemented, if I'm a corporation, do I hire an American worker or do I hire a guest worker, an H-1B, who has fewer rights, who can be paid less, and who I can control? It's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
You've set up the incentive structure to favor the foreign worker over the American worker. And who wants that? Well, the corporations want that. The immigration attorneys, some of the universities want it. But really, I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to design a worse system. It has nothing to do with merit or competence.
Yeah.
And it's not the best and brightest. These are ordinary skilled workers.
Well, I suppose I think the overarching question here is, do we actually have that large of a labor shortage, right? Like we have, total roughly, because we can only estimate, 1.5 million, skilled guest workers. Do we actually need that?
I think the square answer is no, you don't. And there's lots of different indicators, but the one that's the gold standard is when you have a shortage. We have a free market system. Markets work, right, through supply and demand. And how do they clear? They clear through price signals. And in the labor market, it's just like any other market. You have the price being the wage. Okay, so if there was a real shortage of workers, in this case, the supply of U.S. workers, you'd be seeing wages going through the roof. Well, and I've done work on this. You can look at the government data. There is, even in software development, which we think of as being perpetually in shortage, there's been no increase. It's been flat or declining in terms of real terms, and even relative to other occupations. So we have a surplus of those workers, U.S. workers. And when you hear people cry about shortages, they'll pick out, like one indicator or another to try to support themselves. They never talk about wages. Because wages is where the rubber hits the road, right? If you have a shortage of gasoline, prices go up, right? Prices of the gas pump. If we had a shortage of workers, prices go up. But those price signals are also important because they then send a signal back to students and the potential people for a future pipeline in terms of supply. Like, do I want to go into medicine, which is a secure, high-paying job, or do I want to go into something where I don't have much job security and I'm being undercut by guest workers?
Yeah.
Well, where am I going to go?
Yeah. Well, and it seemed to me like, when I was coming through the education system, it was like, everyone should learn to code. Like that's actually where you're going to make, a lot of money.
And in fact, we see the numbers have gone through the roof in terms of U.S. students who've gone in and sort of drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
Where computer science degrees, I'm not talking about enrollment, I'm talking about degrees. People who finish their degrees, bachelor's degrees, is at record levels. Engineering degrees are at record levels. And that's not foreign students. That's all U.S. students. Mm-hmm. So about 90%, 95% of undergrads in engineering and computer science are U.S. citizens or permanent residents. So we have huge numbers. And then, I usually try not to talk about the short term, but there's short term what's happened over the last 18 months or 2 or 3 years. It's been huge tech layoffs, and that's had reverberations on recent graduates. And so you've had a number of anecdotes where you've got like a Berkeley professor coming out and saying his top computer science students can't get jobs, U.S. Graduates. And then the Wall Street Journal's done a number of stories. And then anecdotally, I talk to students. My wife's also an academic. We talk to lots of students. You're seeing a softness in the labor market.
Yeah.
And this lottery is going to give away 85,000 jobs.
Yeah. So what's the difference between, just give us an overarching view of some of these other, skilled guest worker programs. We primarily, when we did this episode with Kevin a few weeks ago, we primarily focused on the H-1B, but talk about some of these other programs and what sort of their strengths and weaknesses are.
So the H-1B is most talked about for two reasons. One, it's the largest, but secondly, because there's been scandal after scandal on the H-1B program dating back to 1990. So 60 Minutes did an expose of $10 an hour computer programmers being hired on H-1Bs back in 1992.
Wow.
And so Congress went back and tried to put protections in, but they were inept in the way that they put protections in. But part of what they did was they added transparency. So we have a lot of data on H-1Bs. We know a bit about, what jobs they're in, which employers they have and things like that, right? And over the years, we've gotten transparency. So it gets a lot of attention. But there are big programs like the L1 for multinational corporations that bring in hundreds of thousands of workers. There's one that's not even authorized by Congress statutorily called the OPT, the Optional Practical Training, which is probably about 300,000 workers. And there's no transparency. We have no idea how many, where they are, what they're doing, what occupations. They don't have to be paid a wage. I've had former international students who have been on OPT for zero wage. I mean, imagine competing against that.
Yeah.
And part of what they're doing is they're hoping that they're going to win the lottery or that they'll get a paid job. They just want to stay in the U.S. And so they're undercutting then our own recent graduates. So you've got OPT, which is really still a student visa. It's not even a work visa. It's never been authorized by Congress, just made up administratively. The L1, the J1, you've got the E3, which is essentially an H-1B, but for Australians.
Oh.
Why do we have an Australian H-1B?
Why do they get a carve out?
Well, they got a carve out because they try to put all of these visa programs into free trade agreements.
Okay.
And so when they signed the Australia Free Trade Agreement, the Australia-US bilateral free trade agreement, they were trying to put in visas. They call it Mode 4, labor mobility across countries. And because that was getting scrutiny from Congress, in terms of the free trade agreements, they decided to put it through. But this is important, right? Because what happens is you get this sort of visa creep where you get additional visa programs. On the surface and individually, they don't look like much, 10,000 E3 for Australians, but cumulatively, you add all of these up and you get to the 1.5 million guest workers, which has a huge effect on the economy, especially in terms of U.S. workers undercutting their wages and working opportunities.
Yeah. We were talking earlier about, that the Biden administration had the opportunity to continue, some of the work that the Trump administration had done on reforming some of these programs. And when talking about some of these Democratic senators, by the way, like, there's actually you can make the case for it, from the left as to why you should do it. Why do you think there wasn't, a huge appetite for taking that on?
I didn't have a good visibility into the Biden administration. They didn't come to me to talk to me about things. I think personnel is policy. We hear that aphorism a lot. And so I think the people they put in charge of immigration in the White House, Doug Rand and Amy Nice, they were Chamber of Commerce or they were immigration attorneys selling immigration services. And so they were all about how do we expand these programs because our their personal clients were benefiting from it. And I guess labor, just wasn't a big enough priority to push things through.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll be very interested, to see how all of this goes over the next couple of years. We'll see what labor and DHS get up to, but we're going to go now to the members only section. So for those of you maybe listening to this podcast for the first time, we have two levels at which you can join our membership program. You can be either a truther or a statesman. And basically what that gets you access to is events that we do here in DC, as well as an extra couple of minutes with each of the guests that we bring in here. So we're going to talk with Dr. Hira about what's coming around the corner that nobody else is thinking about as it relates to this immigration issue. Hopefully we'll see you over there, but we're going to go now to the members only section. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Moment of Truth podcast. Again, as a reminder, if you'd like to join any of our academic programming that we have going on in the spring or in the summer, you can find more about that at americanmoment.org. Please rate and review this podcast, 5 stars only, please. We promise it really does help. And the more cool guests we have, the better. So you rating and reviewing helps make this podcast look good, helps us get cooler people to come on. Again, you can find out everything about American Moment and all the things we have going on at americanmoment.org. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier and Hunter Smith, with original graphics and title cards by Jared Cummings. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is americanmoment.org.